Yeah, I am so pleased and so grateful and happy that Parami's been able to come and join us tonight. Our movement and our order would not be what it is if it wasn't for Parami. She's a very important figure, a very important person in our history and our lineage. She had a really strong connection with Bhante, with Sangha. And one of the things that always makes me laugh is when she tells the tales of traveling across America with Bhante on his poetry tours. So she had spent a lot of time with him, and talking to her about him is always very lovely. You can see what a strong friendship they had. She's a pioneer in our movement. She spent her order life traveling the world, building Sangha, setting up centers, ordaining people. It spent until recently she was the international order convener, and that meant that the movement, as a worldwide entity, a worldwide movement, is really in her bones. It's partly this makes her, for me, synonymous with the Bodhisattva Ideal, which is what she's going to be talking about tonight and what our theme is at the moment. The recent lockdown ordinations wouldn't have happened without Parami, and this kind of pioneering, stepping into the world where it's needed and being able to adapt to whatever is needed, wherever it's needed, where in the world, is very, very strong in Parami. I first met her about 18 years ago in London, and there was an immediate connection, and I just felt she felt like immediately like family. Very easy connection. She's very honest. She's very open, very warm, and very, very down to earth. The Dharma, it really is in her bones. And what I always kind of think about when I think about Parami is her singing voice, actually. I mean, I'm a Gita, so that's kind of going to be a connection for me. She has a really, really beautiful singing voice, and there's something about her voice that you could imagine, you could hear her voice being right at home in the back room of a pub in Glasgow, singing all the old songs, making everyone cry, with her earthy, beautiful voice. And at the same time, she has a voice that really, when you hear her sing in a puja or hear her chant in a puja, she just touches into something transcendental. And if you ever get a chance to be in a puja that Parami leads, I would really recommend that. She's a fantastic person, and I'm thrilled that she's going to be here tonight giving us a lovely talk. So over to you, Parami. Couldn't do justice to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sangha. It's always slightly strange to hear yourself being introduced and kind of listening to people's, experience of you. Anyway, that was very kind. And just to say that all these ordinations that have been happening and have happened, it's been very much a team effort with the other public preceptors, and it's been delightful to work together to just find whatever solutions were needed. It's been although it's been quite a tricky load of decisions to make, I think we've really worked well together, and that in itself is quite a testimony really to teamwork. Okay, I need to talk fast because I don't have very long. So, and I'm one of these people that find it harder to give a short, concise talk than a long and rambly talk. So I'm going to try my bestest to stick to the timing. And but I probably will talk fast because that's what happens when I get excited. But at least as far as I can tell, I think you're all native English speakers on the call. Don't know if there's any native Scottish speakers, but maybe you'll be able to follow me anyway. Okay, so the title that I was given for the talk was For the Welfare of the Many. Just a few words, but it says so much. So that's what I'm going to explore over the next half hour or so. So I'm going to start by reading you a quote from the life of the Buddha. And this quote comes from where he's been enlightened, he's been teaching for some time, and there are now 60 people who've, by hearing his teaching, have also become awakened, become enlightened. So there are now 61 enlightened beings in the world, and the Buddha is addressing these other 60 enlightened beings, who are all, as it happens, bhikkhus. So in the quote, he'll say bhikkhus, yeah? So he says, I am free from all shackles. You are free from all shackles. Go now and wander for the welfare and happiness of many, out of compassion for the world, for the benefit, welfare, and happiness of all. Teach the law that is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, with the meaning and the letter. Explain the life that is utterly perfect. There are creatures with little dust in their eyes who will be lost through not hearing the law. Some will understand the law, so go forth and teach. So that's one of the sayings, one of the quotes where I'm aware that this idea of teaching, of going out and what I love this idea of wander for the welfare of the world. I kind of just quite like that idea of being, I like to think of it as being a kind of monk without a monastery, really. A kind of person who just goes out and is available to teach. So the Buddha is saying, okay, you guys, you've awakened, you're enlightened. That is not the end of the story. He's saying you don't just sit in your cushion and have a lovely meditation and enjoy the experience of being enlightened. He says, no, go out and take that to other beings. And the way he puts that is to go out and teach the Dharma, teach the law. The law is the Dharma. The law is what we've come to recognize as the series of teachings and the practices that help move all of us towards the awakened state. So what he's asking people, what he's saying to his early disciples, these newly awakened beings, he's saying, go and teach the end of suffering, because that's what he had seen. He had seen what he described as those four noble truths. The truth of suffering, that all that arises, all that is born is subject to suffering of all sorts, of all different sorts. There's a cause for that suffering. Existentially, there is a cause for that suffering. And he taught there is an end to that suffering, and there is a path that leads to the end of suffering. So that's what the Buddha is saying to people. You have awakened from suffering. This doesn't mean that they wouldn't suffer if they were to have a brick fall in their head. They would have the physical pain of suffering. But what he's saying is they've broken through what ties them to the suffering of believing that they are separate from all beings. I'll say a bit more about that. So he says to them, go ahead, go out, wander. Wherever you find beings who are suffering, help those beings to see the cause, the end, and the way to the end. So that's what, in a way, that's what he's saying they do for the welfare of the many. And this is the compassion aspect of the Buddhist teaching, the compassion aspect of not just sitting there with one's own enlightenment experience, awakened experience, but to take that outwards to all beings. And again, this is part of our own practice, isn't it? In a way, it's to the extent that we do awaken, and that might be quite a wee awakening, or it might be quite a big awakening, that we don't just sit with that for ourselves, but that the purpose almost of being awake, to the extent one is awake, is to help create the conditions for other beings to also see the end of suffering. And he says it in a number of occasions, and there's another one where he's on his deathbed, just to read a little quote from, just to kind of anchor this into the Pali Canon, into the early teachings. So if I can just find the bit, because I haven't marked it. So he's kind of in his deathbed and he's just saying to people, you know, it won't be long now before I actually come to the end of this life. And he says, the matters which I have discovered and proclaimed should be thoroughly learned by you, practiced, developed, and cultivated. And this is the important part, he says, so that this holy life may endure for a long time, that it may be for the benefit and happiness of the multitudes, out of compassion for the world, for the benefit and the happiness of all beings. So very early on in the Buddha's enlightenment or the Buddha's awakening and at his deathbed, he makes it very clear that this teaching, this experience which he has had, the teaching which he's offered and given to people is not to be held as something precious. Its preciousness is for sharing. So that in a way we have there that whole expression of compassion. You also find, and I'll just mention this very briefly because I think it's important, you also find in the Pali Canon lots of examples of very practical compassion and kindness, very practical metta. And two examples I wanted to just mention briefly, and I won't go into great detail about them. One is an incident that happens, which Sangha Bhante talks about in his lecture, A Case of Dysentery. And this is where the Buddha and his companion, I think it's Ananda, are traveling and they come across an old monk who's lying in his own kind of excrement, really. He has dysentery, he's ill, and he's not being very well looked after. And the Buddha says, what's happened here? And some of the monks say, oh, well, you know, he's kind of old and, you know, he's not very active anymore. And the Buddha says, that doesn't matter. It's all the more reason to look after him. So the Buddha and his companion actually clean this old monk. It's a very beautiful example of just how, however awake, you know, however lofty it might seem to be a Buddha, when it came to it and he was faced with practical suffering, he was able and willing to give practical support and help. The other example that I wanted to mention was an example that's probably quite well known, was very well known, which is the example of a woman called Kisa Gotami. And Kisa Gotami has a son who dies, and she's so distraught with grief that she can't accept that this child has died. So she goes to various healers, goes to all sorts of people, asking for their help. And they just all say to her, woman, this child is dead. There is no help. There is no healing. There is nothing can be done. And then somebody tells her to go to the Buddha, and she goes to Gautama the Buddha, and she says the same thing. Please, can you help me? She's carrying this dead child. You know, can you imagine that feeling? You know, she's so distraught that she just cannot let go. And the Buddha doesn't say to her, let go, woman, this child is dead. He says to her, I can help you. And he gives her a condition. He says, you must find a home where you can get a mustard seed. And she thinks, a mustard seed, they're everywhere. That's easy. The Buddha says, yeah, but it has to come from a home where no one has ever died. So she goes from house to house looking for this mustard seed. Everywhere she goes, people say to her, of course you can have a mustard seed. My goodness, if that's going to help heal your child, bring your child back to life, have as many mustard seeds as you need. And then she says, but has anybody ever died in this house? And they say, oh, my mother died before, my son died, my in-laws died. Every single home there is someone who's died. And what happens there is that she recognizes that although her grief is individual to her, it's actually universal, that every human being is touched by this suffering of illness and death. So she goes back to the Buddha and she's able to let go, and she's able to lay down her dead child. And she then goes to the Buddha to use that expression, she takes refuge in the Buddha, and she herself becomes an awakened disciple. And I tell you this story partly because I think it displays not only the compassion aspect of the Buddha's awakening, but also the wisdom aspect, because he didn't just kind of say, you know, you'll never get a cure. He didn't say to her, have you never heard of impermanence? You know, he didn't give her a teaching about the basis of Buddhism being that all things that arise will pass. He said he gave her the conditions to find that out for herself, to really see that on a deep level. And I'll come back, before I end the talk, I'll come back to what it was that Kisa Gotami actually saw in that moment. So when we think of these examples, I think they're good examples of the Buddha's wisdom and compassion. And that aspect of the Buddha's compassion is the aspect that's known or takes fruit later in the later Buddhist texts as the Bodhisattva Ideal, which Sangha mentioned. So the Bodhisattva Ideal is the ideal, the idea, the aspiration that every practice that we don't do just for our own well-being, but we do for the welfare and the well-being of all. And there's so much that one could say. I mean, I could give you a whole talk on just what is a bodhisattva. In fact, I have done many talks on what is a bodhisattva. I've actually led whole retreats on what is a bodhisattva, but in 30 seconds, I shall try my best to say that the word bodhisattva means sattva is a being, bodhi is awakening or awakened. So a bodhisattva is an awakening being. But the point of the Bodhisattva path is that awakening, the orientation of that awakening is that it's not an awakening for oneself, but an awakening to benefit all beings. So there's all sorts of levels of that. There are archetypal bodhisattvas that represent the different aspects of the enlightened mind. So I'm not quite sure, because I don't know many of you, I don't know how familiar this material is, so I don't want to say too much, but I don't want to just gloss over it either in case it's relatively new to some of you maybe. Those bodhisattvas like Avalokiteshvara, like Tara, they're all different aspects of the enlightened mind. So there's aspects that represent compassion or wisdom or energy, etc. And I won't say more than that, except that those archetypes symbolize the awakened aspects of the awakened mind. But then there are also, on the more human level, there are also beings who aspire to and beings who live the Bodhisattva ideal in their lives. And that's kind of what really inspires me, is the idea that aspiration to live one's life, not just for one's own self, but in a way that benefits and doesn't harm, in a very deep level, I find so incredibly inspiring. In fact, it's the thing that got me hooked, as it were, not only into Buddhism, but into Sangharakshita's particular approach to Buddhism, where he really highlights this aspect of the Buddhist path. And it's found more, you find it in the Pali Canon, but in the Pali Canon, you don't get it quite so explicitly. It becomes more explicit as time goes on, and it becomes more explicit in the schools that are known as the Mahayana schools of Buddhism. So later Buddhism that you find in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, you find this idea of becoming a bodhisattva much more thought through, much more developed. And I thought I'd read you a little bit from the Ratnaguna Samchaya Gatha. It's a bit of a mouthful. What it means is the verses on the precious qualities of the perfection of wisdom. And I will say a bit, I'll hopefully manage to tie this up with you. I tie this up for you in why I'm bringing it in at this point. So the Ratnaguna Samchaya Gatha is part of a corpus of Mahayana texts known as the Prajna Paramita, which means the perfection of wisdom. Okay, and it's probably one of, if not the earliest of this corpus of texts, and at least part of it probably dates from 100 years before the Christian era. So it's pretty old. And it opens, I'm just going to read you the opening to it because it's wonderful. Call forth as much as you can of love, of respect, and of faith. Remove the obstructing defilements and clear away all your taints. Listen to the perfect wisdom of the gentle Buddhas, taught for the weal of the world, for heroic spirits intended. So what you have here is a kind of exhortation to the Bodhisattva life. It's an exhortation to find within ourselves faith, love, and to really do whatever's necessary to kind of be, if I can use this, I'm using this metaphorically, but to become a channel for that power of love so that we act in a way that's in harmony with the power of love. So I'm going to read you a little bit from Sangha's commentary on this, because I think this gives a really nice picture of the enlightenment having those different aspects. He says, the enlightenment of the Buddha was not a cold and detached knowledge. He saw with warmth, with feeling. What's more, he saw everything as beautiful. The Buddha saw everything as pure beauty because he saw everything with compassion. Just as conversely, when you hate someone, they appear ugly. When, through metta, you see things as beautiful, you will naturally experience joy and delight. From that joy and delight will flow spontaneity, freedom, creativity, and energy. And he says, this flow of energy and freedom is the constant experience of the Bodhisattva. How cool is that? So to put oneself in that path is not to become awakened in some kind of, oh, I've got to become awakened. It's full of joy, it's full of love, and it's full of compassion. Another text which describes the life of a bodhisattva is a text that's used a lot within Triratna. It was the very first text that Sangha ever did a study on. And it's a text called the Bodhichitta. This is quite a bit later than the Ratnaguna Samchaya Gatha. It's the 8th century of the Christian era. And it's composed by a poet and sage called Shantideva. There isn't time to say much about him, but he was a monk at Nalanda University. He had a reputation for being very lazy and not really studying very much. And then one day he just produced verbally this extraordinary work, the Bodhichitta, which is poetry, it's challenging, it's a path for practice, it's everything. It's philosophy, it's practice. The translation of Bodhichitta is the life, a guide to the life of the Bodhisattva. So to the Bodhisattva, a guide to the life of one who wants to live, to awaken for the sake of all beings. And it's in 2 parts. The first part is a vow or aspiration. And this is what, in a way, happens when one decides that the Bodhisattva path is the path that we want to follow. There's an aspiration, there's a vow. And this vow is known as the Bodhichitta vow, Bodhichitta being the heart or the mind of enlightenment and awakening. And it's the experience of Bodhichitta that makes one a Bodhisattva. And this text is all about Shantideva's experience. So he tells us first his vow, his aspiration, and then the rest of it is what's known as the establishment of that vow, which are the paramitas, which are the perfections, or the paramis, just to throw that in. Paramis Pali, paramitas Sanskrit. So my name could be translated as perfection, but when I was given it by Sangha, he made a point of saying, don't think of it as perfection, think of it as perfecting, as a verb rather than a noun, and constantly kind of going beyond. So that's what those paramitas, those perfections are not end states, but states and aspects of our practice that we constantly try to move beyond where we find ourselves. And those paramitas, one of them is the perfection of wisdom. So we're back in touch with that earlier text, which talks about the perfection of wisdom. And in the Bodhicharyavatara, we're told that that perfection of wisdom, I mean, it's a great big long chapter, and it's a dialogue between different schools, and it's completely and utterly mind-blowing. But the first couple of lines of it just say, it is agreed that there are two truths, the conventional and the ultimate. This is moving into quite metaphysical territory here, and I don't have very long, so just going to try very briefly to say what I understand that to mean. I understand that to mean that we have relative existence, we exist. You might have come across the idea of Shunyata of emptiness, and that's what that ultimate truth is. And what that is saying is that within every phenomenon, whether it's a human being, whether it's a universe, whether it's an atom, every phenomenon arises in dependence upon conditions. And with the changing of those conditions and the cessation of those conditions, that phenomenon no longer exists as that phenomenon. Yeah. To penetrate that a little bit more deeply, what it's saying is that everything that arises in dependence upon conditions, and that therefore every phenomenon lacks an inherent self, an inherent, nothing arises of its own accord. Everything arises in dependence upon conditions. So what that says is that there is no separate self. What I experience as me conventionally exists. Of course it does. If somebody comes and hits me, I will feel it. And I'll try not to hit them back, but I'll have a reaction, I'll have a response. So conventionally, that is the case, and that is the world that we live in, the world of conventional reality. But the deeper we penetrate in our practice, the deeper the wisdom aspect of our practice can go, the more we realize that that self that we experience as separate, as fixed, as unchanging, as solid, has no quality of solidity, has no unchanging aspect to it, but that everything that I experience as me and mine is a coming together of all those different conditions, and that as those conditions change, then that phenomenon also changes. There is no separate intrinsic self. And that, if you like, is what Kisa Gotami recognised as she wandered and as she was told again and again. She saw the truth of impermanence, that nothing lasts forever, that everything is subject to change. That's its impermanent quality. But she was also able to penetrate that more deeply and see not only the impermanence, but the insubstantial quality of everything that arises, because she saw the conditions were such that what she carried with her was no longer a being, as it was no longer her son, her child. It was only one aspect. The conditions had changed, that no longer was there there was no essence of that child that was still there to be found. So apologise for such a quick kind of run at wisdom, but hopefully it's a taster, and there's all sorts of ways you can explore that more thoroughly. So that's seeing through and really penetrating into that sense that what I experience as me, as fixed, is not a fixed and unchanging entity. The other side of that is that I realise that I am connected with all beings. You sometimes hear people talking about interconnectedness. It's a great buzzword. And it's important to recognise that it's not just a buzzword of, okay, you know, man, like we're all totally interconnected, and isn't that like, you know, I used to think that in my dope days or in my druggy days, but the Buddha's not actually pointing you in that direction. That interconnectedness arises as the other side of recognising that we're not separate, because there's no set, firm, intrinsic, separate ego or self. So as we see that, again, the natural response, therefore, is compassion. Because as I recognise I suffer, I recognize too that all beings like myself are subject to suffering. All beings like myself seek happiness and its causes. So there's a sense, therefore, of wanting to move towards and to help create the conditions for all beings to see through suffering. So what does all that mean for us as practitioners? Does it mean that we have to kind of somehow stop loving because we recognize that we're not separate, and therefore, I don't know, do we recognize that there is no ego, there is no self, therefore there is no nothing? And that's not what this teaching is saying. On the contrary, I deeply and strongly believe that the more deeply we can penetrate the true nature of our existence, the more we will break through the self-clinging nature of the belief that I am the center of the universe. And the more we break through that, then the more free we are to love more freely. We're more able to respect, we're more able to connect, and we're more able to help create connections. So the more that we can, within our practice, at whatever level we're practicing, the more we can find ways to really recognize that we're not little separate, unconnected entities, then the more I think our compassion will arise. And that is the heart of the Bodhichitta Avatara, and it's the heart of the Ratnaguna Samchaya Gatha. They're both pointing towards, on the one hand, this recognition of the falseness of our sense of self, and the other side of that being the recognition that all beings are connected. And it's not only the heart of those teachings, it's also the heart of the Heart Sutra, which many of you will have come across. And that is also part of that perfection of wisdom corpus. And the heart is not just, it's not the heart as in my beating heart, although there's an aspect to that. It's the heart of the matter. It's the crucial heart of everything. It's the understanding of that emptiness, and that's what the Heart Sutra is all about. If maybe some of you have never done a puja, or maybe you haven't had the opportunity to hear the Heart Sutra, it's an extraordinary piece. If we even just approach it as poetry, it's so mind-opening, it's so heart-opening. But also the more we can kind of penetrate what it's saying to us, the more we recognize that sense that of what's known as emptiness, but that emptiness is full. It's full of love, respect, and concern for each other. And the interesting thing is that the figure that you find in the Heart Sutra is not a figure necessarily associated with wisdom, although this is a perfection of wisdom text. It's a figure associated with compassion. It's Avalokiteshvara. So the Heart Sutra opens by evoking Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, when he penetrated deeply. So you have compassion and wisdom completely married there. And that figure of Avalokiteshvara was a figure that Sangha chose to give us as a symbol of our order and our community, because it's a figure, particularly, it comes in different versions, if you like, different forms. And one of the forms is a form with 1,000 arms. And those 1,000 arms represent the moving out into the world and the creation of the conditions for the welfare of all beings. So at his heart, Avalokiteshvara holds a stone, a precious jewel, which is the jewel of Bodhichitta, that jewel of an awakened heart, and he holds it at his heart. But it gives him the impetus to move out with those 1,000 arms into the world, so that all practices that he represents, and therefore in a way all practices that we as a community take on as part of those 1,000 arms. I'll say no more about that, because Sangha, I think somebody's going to be talking about that in the next talk in the series, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity to hear of Avalokiteshvara, because he is the essence of compassion and the essence of the heart of everything and the essence of practice for the welfare of all. Thank you.